Winter feeding, I guess it's not all that safe if you don't do the rules right.
That's right. There's potential. Let's put it that way. There's potential for some grave issues to rear their heads if things aren't picked up when they should be, Rob. And I guess the number one thing to talk about at the moment is nitrate poisoning. It's definitely a risk area right now, risk time of year, and I guess the reason for that is that when we have periods of lower growth rate in the plant, for instance, low light levels, as you know, the day length starting to drop away, and overcast weather, you know, these southerly weather systems coming through, and drought systems as well. So we've still got issues up in North Canterbury at the moment. So when the plant gets under a bit of growth stress, it tends to accumulate nitrates from the soil, and then we get a bit of a growth spurt, and we have very high concentrations of nitrate left in both leaf and stem of plants. And so brassicas are a classic for this, but we also see the problem in ryegrass and plants such as that as well. Symptoms, typically what happens is these nitrates, they muck up the chemistry of the hemoglobin that carries oxygen around the body, and so the symptoms are rather like asphyxia actually. So we have animals that are blowing a lot, very lethargic, can't be moved without really feeling the pinch and blowing, and as the disease progresses, of course, they go down and they can die actually. So important to pick up on those things. Valuable animals can be salvaged with medications, but the best thing is to pick up on the early symptoms and know if you're feeding risky crops. So testing crops.
You can actually test the leaf to see, can't
Absolutely, you? Leaf and stem. So you can submit a crop sample, just a handful torn from the area that's being fed, and the local veterinary clinic should be able to test that for you to determine nitrate levels and a risk factor.
One of the clues, I think, is the purple colour rather than the green. Is that right?
Can be, yes. In brassica crops, it can sort of have a purpling that may alert us to some high nitrate levels. If we got it getting risky crops, it doesn't mean it's a waste. You know, it can be fed, but it needs to be managed correctly. And so that's when you need to, especially with cattle, make sure they're going onto a break with some gut fill, so they're not going to gorge themselves. Absolutely, and maybe break feeding and being a little bit more astute on how much access they're getting, and controlled access to the crop is quite important, and can be life saving for the animal and money saving for the farmer, of course.
Tell me about redwater.
Redwater we don't see a lot these days. It was another typical brassica disease. The more modern cultivars are less risky, but I guess the risk is still around, and there are still cultivars of brassicas around that still have this problem. It was caused through high levels of a chemical agent in the plant that causes the red blood cells to break down, to burst, if you like, and the hemoglobin that's contained within those red blood cells, it passes through into the urine. And so the classic sign is redwater, is a ready urine, and the symptoms as the disease progresses is actually rather identical to nitrate poisoning. Again, we're getting no oxygen carrying capacity in the blood, and so the symptoms are similar. So it's something to be aware of, and if those sort of symptoms are seen, then of course, you know, put 2 and 2 together and contact your veterinary surgeon. But yeah, I think it's something to be held in mind if there's brassicas being fed, and you know, quite important again for winter feeding to have that in the back of one's mind, particularly if you see the symptoms of redwater. Of course, there's other causes of redwater, leptospirosis and whatnot, but if they're on winter feed crops and you're seeing these symptoms, then it's one thing.
It's a bit of a clue, isn't it?
Yeah.
So small breaks and full guts full of straw or hay.
Yep, and quantify risks. So test crop. If you're worried, it's a cheap insurance. Just get the crop or the pasture checked if you're worried. If you've had a pretty slow growth time frame with the plant, and then all of a sudden you've had a bit of a spurt, then definitely I think they're the risk periods, and get the feed tested.
Nick, do we still have problems with listeria?
We do actually. Traditionally, listeria was a problem seen with poorly preserved silage. Somehow the issues, the environment in a poorly preserved silage stack, if the pH wasn't low enough, we could get conducive environment for listerial bugs to grow and grow and grow. And so that was traditionally the concern, and again, of course, because of supplemental feeding with silage, it's a winter problem. The typical symptoms were neurological, so it was called circling disease actually. It often would affect the one side of the face. It would get in through the gum and the animal would just circle and circle, and we still do see those symptoms. But more commonly these days we're starting to see what's called enteric listeriosis, which causes diarrhea, and much more common these days in sheep. And we're seeing that particularly when sheep are grazing in kind of moist areas with lots of decaying matter, in particular perhaps under or around pine plantations and
okay, because of the needles and stuff.
Exactly.
And any trash, I guess, that's died and has gone down because the grass is very short, even though it's green. They're
That's
picking
right.
that up.
Yeah, and so I think obviously those environmental issues around that those areas of ground are conducive to listerial overgrowth. And yeah, so there has been many documented cases of enteric listeria where we've had deaths. But yeah, we still do see the neurological cause. It's a bit of a sporadic problem, but it can alert one to the fact that maybe the quality of silage supplementation isn't quite as
Can you test it?
should be. You can't really. I guess you could culture it, but I guess it's a bit of I think a non-efficient use of resources. It's, as I said, it's usually a sporadic disease, and I think it's just a good lesson in maintaining feed quality, really. And so, good silage preservation. You know, I guess it's. Yeah, I think in this day and age, people should know what they're doing if they're feeding silage.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Now, goiter I've always thought of as a human disease.
Yeah, so goiter, again, related to generally feeding of tuber crops. So often see it with swede and turnip feeding and things like this. A lot of these crops contain compounds in them that bind up the iodine and make it less available. So it's not that they're deficient in iodine per se, but they just make the iodine much less available. And it's particularly a problem in the winter because when we're feeding pregnant stock, particularly sheep, but the number one animal that gets these problems are goats, actually well above everything else.
Really?
And then what happens is because we've got a poor iodine availability during the pregnancy, we get weak, sickly animals born, and they often do have goiter. They have large thyroid glands, just like some of us remember looking at the old pictures before the days of iodized salt and people getting goiter, and it's exactly the same symptoms, except we see it in newborn animals, lambs and kid goats in particular. And that is a major risk factor associated with winter feeding of tuber crops, and can be prevented with supplementation. So either oral supplementation with regular drenches or a depot injection to supplement the iodine. So,
Nick, thank you very much indeed.